Welcome to the first episode of the Climate Conversation, brought to you by the Business Weekly. Business Weekly is a publication under the Zim Papers brand, and today we are talking about all issues to do with the climate and climate change, and we are joined by the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry, that's Professor Matondi. Professor, welcome to Climate Conversation.
Thank you so much, Kutai. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Yes.
So, Prof, it's about more than just above 2 months since we went to COP28.
Yes.
What were the key priorities for Zimbabwe at COP28?
Yeah, just to inform Zimbabweans that Zimbabwe was well represented at COP28 in Dubai in November to December of 2023. But you need to know the history of COPs. And remember the other year, 2022, we were in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27. So these are conference of parties of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that we hold on an annual basis to discuss and pick up on issues to do with climate in general, but that touches on many other issues to do with development, economic development, social development, and how these are affected by climate change. So each year we do an audit on account of what we would have achieved within the year, but also the prospects of what needs to be done more around climate question, or the climate crisis, as some would put it.
And for Zimbabwe, what were the key priority areas that we wanted addressed at COP28?
So you can classify them into generic climate issues that are of a global nature. There are so many of them. Then there are those that are specific to Africa, and those that are specific to Zimbabwe, but those that are specific to the global south. So our positioning is influenced by that classification. We are part of the Africa group of countries that negotiates as a bloc, and we have got what is called the Africa group of negotiators, and Zimbabwe is part of that group at the ministerial level, but also at a technical level, represented by myself as the Permanent Secretary. So on the key issues, position issues that we went with at COP, there are several ones that builds from the very first COP, issues to do with mitigation, for instance, issues to do with adaptation, issues to do with how, as a country and as a globe, we are able to achieve the 1.5 degrees by 2030, issues to do with the role of youth, the role of women, and how they are impacted by climate change. But more importantly, given that the location of this particular COP was in Dubai, issues to do with the position of fossil fuels, that is gas and oil, was very, very, very prominent in the discussions. But before we even started the discussions, we had some unfinished business from COP27. And on COP27, he had made a decision that loss and damage was supposed to be implemented immediately. That is what we negotiated and came up with. Loss and damage in the sense that climate change is disproportionately affecting the whole globe. And its major marker is on loss and damage. Loss of life, loss of property, and damage to property. And that damage runs into billions of dollars that no country on its own is able to address. And therefore we needed then to have a loss and damage fund established. That was agreed, but never implemented in the whole of 2023. So the first business of the day for COP28 was to, and that was very smart for the presidents of UAE, who is heading COP now, COP28, was to first to deal with the business of that unfinished business, to do with loss and damage. And for that, the decision was then debated in plenary at the very first time. An agreement was struck that we needed to have the fund operationalized before the end of COP itself, rather than to wait for the following year. And then the country started making pledges immediately. So there were various pledges that were made. The real pledges that were confirmed probably were around $300 million, but going all the way to about $700 million by the end of COP28, which is a very small fraction of what is needed to address loss and damage even at country level. But it gave us a signal that at least after more than 28 years of negotiating using the same provision, at least there was an achievement. But achievement that came after long protracted negotiation. So we were very happy that the loss and damage became a key issue. And for Zimbabwe, that was also our primary issue, building from COP27. So we would say that the loss and damage was an achievement. Then there were a raft of other issues that we felt were important and germane to Zimbabwe. And these include issues to do with food security, agroecology, and water resilience. These
maybe Prof, yes. On the loss and damage fund, yes. We have had the climate mitigation adaptation fund, the funds that never came. Now we have this loss and damage fund. How positive are you that we'll start to see funds coming in for the loss and damage?
I think we need to first to understand the conflation of the climate funding that were negotiated from 2010 and up to 2028 and remains a key issue. And for Africa, we demanded that we needed $100 billion for us to be able to both mitigate and adapt. And of that amount, by 2021 COP26, only about 76 million was provided. Then we started questioning what is $76 billion provided, and there was no clear answer, because there's a conflation between development finance, between aid, and between funding that comes through investment. So the sum total of it is what is then given as the climate funding, when we feel that it is not. So for the last 3 years, we have been negotiating, and we saw that there was no alternative, there was no progress. So we said it might be better off to have small funding portfolios that are very specific to issues. This is the context in which now we have the loss and damage fund. You also have the adaptation fund, where many countries have got pledged. And at COP28, a health and climate fund was also developed. I think it's about $1 billion. Then there are also funds like the the green climate funds that also increased in amount. So in terms of democratizing the space for climate finance, I think we are getting there. In terms of the actual disbursements of that fund for climate action, that's where we are found wanting. And we are happy that for us, loss and damage funding, based on the fact that we pushed for it, is germane to the global south and also important for Zimbabwean countries that suffer from irregular climate patterns and also impact.
Now, still on the loss and damage fund, now in the context that funds from the global north, they don't come as quickly as you would want. You could have a disaster, a cyclone, or any other disaster, climate-related disaster. From a Zimbabwean point of view, I remember at some point you mentioned that we might need to have our own loss and damage fund, a localized one. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. A loss and damage fund will not be a big, it's a no-brainer, because we have actually been doing aspects of funding for loss and damage. Remember when Cyclone Idai and other cyclones that have been plummeting the country for quite some time, we have been able to trigger our disaster risk management system to be able to fund aspects of it. But it does not go all the way to deal with people's loss and damage. People's loss in terms of lives, and people's loss in terms of the loss of human life, but also the loss of opportunities for those who remain behind. We can't completely compensate for that loss. But we can, to a minimum extent, say these families have been affected by climate change, and we need to work with them through life. That's the whole purpose of the loss and damage fund, and its incremental additionality that we require in terms of to figure out how best we can meet the needs of our people. That's our point. And the source of the money could be quite varied. Of course, we would plead with the Treasury that at least a percentage of the budget has to go into the loss and damage. And remember, the climate secular of August 2022 or September 2022 specifically demanded that ministries and agencies must mainstream climate change in their budgets. So the expectation is that in all of our budgets we must have a climate component. Whether that has been done or not, it's one thing.
It's one thing, yeah.
But that's what we want to fight for. And if you look at the structure of our ministry in terms of how it has been reconfigured, the aim is to ensure that climate is mainstreamed across society, both at the national level, but also in a devolved sense. So you will see more action happening at the provincial level, where we are then saying that if we anchor a national climate fund, it must also be devolved in a sense, because different provinces are disproportionately affected by climate change in different ways. So you also need to have a set of tools of preparedness around loss and damage at their own provincial level in a decentralized fashion.
Obviously, government can't do it alone. What role do you see the private sector playing in terms of the loss and damage fund, as well as climate mitigation and adaptation?
But when you look at now at the global matrix, much of the funding that is said to have gone into climate has actually gone to the private sector, because it is about repurposing major projects, for instance, in water, in renewable energy, or even in mainstream energy itself, in communications, in ICTs. All this build into tools that are aimed at mitigating climate change. And that's where the largest amount of money is gone. And our private sector, maybe not much is gone into it, because they are still trying to understand where do they fit within the climate discourse, and we are trying to help them now to then say there are opportunities. On the 16th of May last year, government cabinet pronounced the first carbon credit framework, which is around the carbon credit trade. The aim of the policy is to ensure that we reduce our emissions towards meeting the goal of 1.5 degrees by 2030. And this is very specific to climate emissions. But the actions to be able to do that are within the whole of society, and the private sector plays a very important role in that. And there are two parts. There's land-based, where we need to have carbon sequestration, where this nature, the trees that you're seeing, are the natural sequesters of carbon, and need to be protected, and we need to grow them. Then you've got the non-land-based sector, where you need to have investment in equipment and infrastructure that is necessary for that, where now the private sector can come in and play a role. But we also need them, as they do their products, to then be able our products as green as they should be. Not green in the sense of the color, but green in the sense that they are not emitting greenhouse gas emissions or toxic gases into the atmosphere. We want them to do that. We have made achievements with the private sector. There's no doubt about it. We have reduced the amount of chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere to the extent that the ozone layer that we were worried about in the 1980s is no longer there. So that's an achievement, and it's possible. But of course, they are usable gases such as methane and carbon dioxide. Even though the amount of methane is very small, but its trappings of carbon is much more toxic than general carbon dioxide. So the private sector can then play a role in that particular sector in terms of what inputs they use in their processing to ensure that the goods and products that they produce are climate compliant and reduces emissions. But if they do that, we are saying the opportunities for us in the climate space to be able to pay for that, because this is a global contribution is there, and that's the reason why we have got the carbon credit framework and the statutory instrument we have put in place, and the opportunities are just galore for the private sector to come and make a contribution.
And looking at the private sector, in fact, all stakeholders, what message is your ministry spearheading in terms of making sure that as a country we play our part in making sure that we have got net zero, and we also reduce in terms of global warming? I understand last year I think was the hottest ever on record. So when you take that message to the various stakeholders in the country, how well received is your message?
I'm hoping that the country receives this well, because the climate change issue is a temperature issue. That's number one. That needs to be acknowledged. And if you then go back to history, it tells you that the global mean temperature started rising from the first industrial revolution, that is in 1700, when most of the global north started industrializing on the basis of using gas and coal. And they've been progressively reducing. However, since 1900, the global mean temperatures have been rising by 0.1% per decade. And when you then project to 2100, you will see that it's possible to reach 2.8 or 3 degrees, and that's catastrophic. What it actually means is that some of the islands will disappear. What it means is that besides the natural climate change that occurs, there's the additionality of the human factor that is causing this for the temperatures to increase, right? So at Paris in 2015, during the Paris negotiations, it was agreed that we needed to reach at least 1.5 degrees by 2030. And that target is an agreed global framework. But based on business as usual, we even in our own NDCs defined that we needed to reduce even more by 40%. But we are saying that we are contributing nothing to the global emissions. But we are ready to join the global community in mitigating and ensuring that we reduce the emissions. This is the reason why we are then saying, if we are playing this Nobel to the world, it also equally must in terms of financing, in terms of technology, capacity development, and ensuring that we get also the appropriate science for us to be able to adapt and also to mitigate. So that's where things are falling short, because we don't have resources that are coming into our space. We have costed the cost of adaptation up to 2030. We need at least $10.3 billion to be able to do that.
That's for Zimbabwe.
Just for Zimbabwe.
10.3 billion.
Yes, that's what we need. But of that, a large proportion is required in agriculture. About 4.7 billion that goes into general agriculture support to mitigate and adapt. But $3 billion, especially for our dams. We have been doing this with domestic, our dams with domestic resources. But for climate compliance, climate adaptation, we need about $3 billion for that. So the bill just to get our agriculture right is around $8 billion out of that $10.3 billion. That's what we're asking from these enormous billions of dollars that are said to be going into the climate finance. That's the small amounts that we want. And if we get that, we can get our agriculture right. But we have never stopped Kutai because of that. We have got the best model to show in the world around how a small nation and smallholder farmers can adapt to climate change. But they can't fully adapt to climate change in a context of large-scale intensity climate weather patterns like we're experiencing now. If you look at it, we used to have 6 seasons, 6 months in a year where you will have very good rains. But that has been reduced to 3. And within those 3 months, sometimes we've got very long dry spells. It's unpredictable. This year it might rain good, or for the next 3 years, then it goes down. We have projected that will happen in the next 10 years or so, until we take action around addressing climate change. And this crisis that we are facing with farmers, with the crops wilting, it's unfortunate, but we need now to work around how do we repurpose that towards smallholder irrigation development, for instance. We have now mastered the water that we require. We need to go to the next stage, because remember, our president always emphasized that water is not the project. What you do with the water is the actual project. So the projects are not coming. And these are in the irrigation. Look at our large dams, Tokem Kotse, look at Gwai Shangani that is upcoming, and a lot of other ones. They are still underutilized. And at the moment, based on the current rainfall season, 75 to 85% of our dams are actually full. The question is, but our crops are wilting. So there is this contradiction. How do we address this contradiction? We need a multi-purpose approach with agriculture, local government and others to come together to then say, how do we seriously deal and address smallholder irrigation to ensure that we utilize the water resources we have. We know that after every 3 years there will be replenishment. We'll get another 3 years of very good rainfall. It will replenish the underground water. It will replenish our dams. Then if we then use that for smallholder irrigation, we get it right. But remember also, in the last 5 years, we strongly promoted conservation agriculture. Through Pumpuza and Intwasa. But when you go back to COP, I think that when everyone was talking and negotiating, people were looking for models. And people then said, oh, here is a model that works, where you ensure food security at household level with using very minimum resources. So that program, I think, answers some of those bigger questions. Yes, but
so in other words, as much as climate change is a global issue, but we can, as a country, mitigate against it.
Yes.
Through your Pfumvudza, through making use of our dams.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So as long as we ensure that we have got food security at household level, at community level, at village level, then we have answered partly part of it. But you then need to complement it with large scale irrigation infrastructure, so that it's complementary. Remember, some of our people live in urban areas or in concentrated population, and they need to be fed. So you need to balance it. You need to balance it out. But at the end, it's not about extensive land for production. It's about how we are going to repurpose and to focus towards the intensive utilization of land that we have. We don't need a lot of land to produce high yields, just small units of land. But if you look at our production patterns for some of our key commodities, such as maize, you get 0.1%, you get one ton per hectare. It's still dismal, but there's scope for improvement. If you improve on that, we'll ensure food security, but also be able to ensure that we mitigate climate change, because that means leaving the ecological land, natural land, to be able to regenerate. So regenerative agriculture is and agroforestry is very important, because that's the whole basis for your carbon sequestration, and we badly need that. Yeah,
as we conclude, Prof, maybe you can highlight to the viewers in terms of what are the focus areas for your ministry, maybe towards climate change, but also maybe other focus areas that you are pushing as a ministry.
Yeah, as a ministry, we are building the institutional framework for responding, so that at least the climate language is understood by society. We have adopted the whole of government and the whole of society approach, and we need you, the media, to come with us to be able to explain to our people the implications of climate change, but also the solutions that are then possible within them, but also beyond them, where we then need others to come in and help them. I think that is a really key priority area, and for that we are mainstreaming climate across all of government and all of society. There are also other issues that relate to climate that are very important. Issues to do with the biodiversity conservation and the ecosystems restoration are key to us. Remember, this week we have just started the United Nations Environment Assembly, UNIA 6 in Nairobi, where these issues are being debated and discussed and negotiated, to do with climate change, to do with biodiversity or nature-based solution, to do with waste and plastics, and there is a global plastic pledge that is coming up, and we believe that those are key priority areas also for us. Issues to do with human-wildlife conflict. You've seen our teams going right throughout the country, asking the people, what is it that you want us to do for you? How can we better repurpose the Human-Wildlife Relief Fund to suit you better and to address your concern? What are some of the developmental questions that are needed within the discourse of human and wildlife? And how do we involve youth, women, and those who are in the margins of society, the disabled, so that we have got a whole of society approach. You have seen us with the First Lady working very closely with children and traditional leaders across the country. That's a key priority and a medium for us to be able to discuss climate change, indigenous knowledge, and all these matters, so that we bring them on the table and then say, what is our position? What is it that we need to do in terms of capacity, in terms of further development of our science and understanding it, but also for the general language that the society understands, where we are all the time. So when climate change hits, it hits in very strange ways. Sometimes you have situations where you have got tectonic shifts, like seismic shifts, that are aligned with cyclones. Sometimes we don't understand the nature science that is involved. Sometimes we have got the sun, but there's also sun is affected by the whole changes in radiation and the global positioning system and all these things that contribute to the natural changes of climate. Our people must be able to understand that these things happen and they need to be prepared for, and appropriate actions at policy in terms of practice, but also in terms of behavior also needs to be calculated in our people. We can do what we can in terms of emissions, even though we are not responsible. But there are certain things that we can do around having just a clean society. This society, we are inundated with waste. How do we manage that? And when things like climate hits, it makes it worse for you to be able to address your waterborne diseases like typhoid, cholera, diarrhea, and so forth. But there are also other airborne diseases that accompany. We are trying to understand that from a science perspective, to understand what is the impact, the relationship between these and climate change, and how are they going to affect our people. Hence, the reason why we have the health and climate finance fund that I'm very pleased to have at a global level, and we are hoping that we'll be able to access some of that to address some of these challenges.
You just reminded me something. The built environment. It seems like we are ignoring the wetlands. Yes. Can you speak to us in terms of what impact does that have?
Wetlands are so dear to us, to the extent that in 2021 we developed the first wetlands policy. We also provided the wetland guidelines. We also have the wetlands map. So they are completely mapped. Not just the wetlands, but the most ecologically sensitive wetlands are also mapped.
But and we are seeing people building in those here.
But it's illegal. But building also is circumstantial, because there are drier parts of the wetlands that are usable. Okay. But there are ecologically sensitive parts of the wetlands that you can't use. So in our map, it reflects. People are trying to build everywhere. You saw what happens in some of the areas. Now when they are flooded, that's when they realize that, no, we are actually in a wetland. But we were warned that don't build in wetlands. So we need to work very closely with local authorities, with Home Affairs and others, to ensure that gazetted wetlands stand just gazetted and must be fully protected. Okay. There are about 355,000 hectares in the whole country, and 27% are still in pristine condition. About 55% of those wetlands require some sort of rehabilitation, and we intend to do that. We are trying to protect them both in the urban areas and also in the rural areas. Remember, we've got 7 wetlands that are internationally gazetted by UNESCO that we are protecting, and they are well protected, even though there are challenges that we face here and there, but they are largely protected, which is the reason why last year a decision was made that we needed to have COP28, that is the Ramsar Convention, the equivalent of climate, will happen here in Vic Falls in July of 2023, to celebrate what Zimbabwe has done in terms of putting importance to wetlands and freshwater resources and the intention to protect. But we need a whole of society approach to appreciate that, both in urban and rural areas, that wetlands are quite vital. If I tell you one fact is that wetlands are actually your most richest carbon sequester. And when you rank them, you have got mangroves on top, then you have got your wetlands, then you have got your general forest. So in terms of the quality of the carbon credit, it is the wetlands that provide the best in the country. And we might as well protect them to ensure that at least we are able to meet our emissions reductions goal, but also ensure that we draw also resources that can go into community development work.
Well, that was the Climate Conversation, the first episode that is brought to you by the Business Weekly, which is a publication under the Zim Papers brand. And today on the Climate Conversation, I was joined by the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Environment, Climate and Wildlife. That's Professor Prosper Matondi. Prof, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kuzai. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you. Yeah. And we are here at the Botanical Gardens.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Make sure that you visit.
Yes.